Hi, guys. I hope that you're having a wonderful Friday. I'm sorry that I can't be with you today. If questions arise, please don't hesitate to contact me. I'm happy to address those questions as they emerge. Please don't forget that you have your first précis due on Monday. And so, again, if there's any questions, please let me know. I'm happy to respond. Today, we are going to be talking about American demography. So what I thought we would do is talk a little bit about what demography is and then some basic information. The first thing I want to do is define demography. And what demography means is it's the study of populations. Basically, it's the careful or close examination of the nature of the population. So you're going to have a chance here in a little while to dig in on the census webpage. And I think you'll find there is a mass amount of information available about who we are as a nation based on the last census. So let's talk a little bit about why this is important information to know in this unit. It's not that just studying population is important, but if we're talking about elections, which is the nature of this unit, then we need to have a sense of who the people are. Because politicians will absolutely need to respond to the population. So one of the things that we need to talk a little bit about is what's public opinion. So what public opinion does is it seeks to find out what the population's perspective is on politics or political issues. So for example, if I were to ask you, how many of you support the advisory program? Essentially, we just created a public opinion poll. I asked you a question in which you responded. And there could be some questions about the validity of that poll. You know, we've been looking at a variety of visual graphics that relate to polls over the course of the last unit. We'll continue to do that this unit. And I think what you'll find is that there should be questions about the nature of the population being polled. Several of you asked that in the last unit. You drew out questions or concerns that you had about the data, and that's incredibly important that you do that. And so part of what we have to do in this unit is try to understand the nature of the American population, because that will help us better understand whether a poll is valid. And those polls influence politicians and the type of answers and the types of policies they champion. So, one of the things that has to happen if a politician wants to know a little bit more about whether a policy he or she is championing is going to fly is they have to create surveys. And we're going to spend all day Monday and part of Tuesday talking about poll science and how surveys are actually created, especially the surveys that are the most valid. So we'll be getting to that. But in order to determine validity of the surveys, we have to have a better sense of who we are, which is sort of my third bullet point here, is how do we determine who we are? Well, the most common way to determine who we are as a nation is through the census. And according to the Constitution, the census is done every 10 years. It's really just very simply a count of the population. Now, I know I say very simply because, quite frankly, it is not remotely a simple process, but it is a process that happens every 10 years in our country. And it's important that we do so, right? Initially, the purpose of the census was to determine how many representatives a state would receive, right? We learned that in Article 1, under what was initially called the Virginia Plan, that it was decided that representation would be based on population. So if that's the case, then you have to survey the population to figure out who's here and count them routinely. And then your representation may need to change, and we'll talk more about that. It's your bottom bullet point called reapportionment. So the most common way to do this is through the census. But, you know, a question you should be asking is it possible to actually count everyone? And then as a follow-up, well, then how accurate is that count? And how do we do sampling to try to determine information on the uncounted people? Because you have to imagine that some people are simply just not counted. They either choose not to respond to the mail-in census form or to the census takers who come to your house. And people choose not to respond for all sorts of reasons. So let's try to figure out what we do know, which is sort of the nature of the people who do respond to the census. And then what we can fill in the gaps through sampling error and sampling size. So what do we know? Well, guys, probably no shock to you, but we're a nation of immigrants. Roughly, and you'll see an updated data, an updated number when you get into the census website, which you'll be playing around with today. But what we do know is that we're a nation of immigrants. There's about 800,000 legal immigrants added to our country every year. Yeah, that's 800,000, folks. And I mean, as you can imagine, there are more illegal immigrants than there are legal. And, recently, I would say probably within the past 5 years or so, there's even been a concern about that word illegal versus legal. And instead, you typically hear the phrase undocumented versus documented. And I think there's connotation associated with that. But nonetheless, there are about 800,000 documented immigrants coming into the country each year. Some of those are here for a variety of reasons. They're here for work visas, studying, etc. So that's a broad category, to be clear. The 2000 census, and you'll be looking up the 2010 census here, but the 2000 census was a really important census. It did a mass survey. It was a very, very effective census in terms of there was little sampling error done, and we'll talk about what that term means a little bit more on Monday. But that census revealed to us that about 69% of our population is white, non-Hispanic. And roughly, these are numbers you're going to want to put down into your notes as we look at the racial breakdown. Roughly 12% of our population in this country identifies as African American. 13% of the population identifies as Hispanic American. About 4% of the population identifies as Asian. And I'm using the term Asian American, African American, Hispanic American to identify sort of ethnicity or like lineage is probably the better word choice, because that would be sort of area of origination. So when I use the term Asian American, which is used in census data, you'll see that does not necessarily mean that the person originally, came from China like last year, but rather that their heritage and their family's heritage is Chinese, but they are identifying themselves as Chinese Americans or Asian Americans. So kind of recognize that sort of flawed language, and I recognize that, and I see that too. About less than 1% of our population identifies as Native American. What was interesting about the 2000 census is it actually allowed people to identify more than one racial group for the first time, right? Because it's absolutely possible that people from two different racial groups would marry and that they would produce a child who has lineage in both of those groups. So, for example, I've referenced before that my grandmother is a member of the Ojibwa tribe, which is also called the Chippewa, from Wisconsin. Right. So does that identify me as Native American? Absolutely, it does. Right. I can identify my lineage as being Native American, but I'm also white, non-Hispanic. My mother's family, originates from England. So, could I actually on the paper identify myself as two racial groups? And the answer is, yeah, I could for the first time in 2000. So recognize that those numbers are still slightly skewed, but it does tell us that at least parts of the population are identifying some sort of lineage to these groups. We do know that the minority population is growing rapidly. In 2000, the expectation was that by 2050, the white non-Hispanic population would be at about 52%. And part of this has to do with racial intermingling. We live in an era today that does not have laws about populations marrying and producing children that come from two different racial groups. If any of you have seen the movie Loving that came out last year, realize that in many states, until the modern era, it was actually illegal for people from two different racial groups to intermarry, much less actually have children. So due to some of the changing social norms and, in fact, laws, we are seeing more mixture of racial groups. And as a result, I think that's why you're going to see that white non-Hispanic population number drop a little bit. However, that still means, of course, that people could potentially identify themselves as belonging, again, to more than one racial group, as we discussed, has happened since the 2000 census. Okay, let's talk about poverty. Today, our